Okay, we'll get started with the next presentation. This is by Samantha Taylor. The title is The Role of Archaeology in Bridging Informational Gaps Between Diasporic Communities, a case study at Pandenarium, Mercer County, Pennsylvania. Samantha Taylor is an archaeologist at New South Associates, Inc. In North Carolina, in the North Carolina office. Although she directs all manners of archaeological fieldwork, her interests are in 19th century farmstead archaeology, African diaspora archaeology, and comparative ceramic analysis. Samantha, you want to get started?
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Samantha Taylor, and today I'll be presenting on a case study at Pandenarium, which is site 36 ME 253 in Mercer County, Pennsylvania. So here's a general outline of what I'll be discussing today, starting with some of the history of Pandamarium and then going into specific details about some of its residents. I'll be discussing Angela Gillette Wintling's 2011 thesis on the site, and then I'll get into more detail about my 2018 thesis on Pandenarium and discuss the methods, results, and interpretations of that study. And then lastly, I'll discuss where we should go from here and what lies in store for the future of the site. So in 1854, with the assistance of local abolitionists, a small community was established along the Indian Run in East Lackawanna County, East Lackawanna Township in Mercer County, Pennsylvania. The settlement was located 10 miles due south of Mercer Borough. At the time of its establishment, the community had no given name. It quickly became referred to as the Indian Run Settlement and sometimes even Utopia. However, modern scholars have come to call it Pandenarium. This name likely refers to the misspelled biblical location of Pandamarium, located along the Euphrates River. The comparison was likely meant to evoke that feeling of hope that was associated with the freed settlement. And it is possible that the name also has Greek origins, with pan meaning all and denarium denoting money. The establishment of Pandenarium was a joint effort between physician and Virginia plantation owner Dr. Charles Everett, his nephew Charles D. Everett of Philadelphia, who was the executor of his will, and the local abolitionists in Mercer County. Everett was the owner of a large plantation in Albemarle County, Virginia, near Charlottesville, and he was also a physician to and neighbor of Thomas Jefferson. Everett died in 1848, and in his will, he manumitted the 20 people he had enslaved. 5 years following his death, these freedmen would make the journey from Albemarle County, Virginia, to Mercer County, Pennsylvania, where Charles D. Everett, Everett's nephew, had purchased land for them to reside. Prior to the arrival of the freedmen in November of 1854, local abolitionists had constructed 24 furnished houses, along with wells, orchards, gardens, and a road that ran through the center of the property. Each house was equipped with tools, linen, clothing, and seeds, and each family was given $1,000 to secure any immediate financial needs that they may have. In November of 1854, 63 freedmen arrived at Pandenarium. This number was more than 2 times the number of individuals freed by Everett's will. This was due to the freedmen purchasing freedom of family members and several fugitive and freed enslaved peoples that had joined the group along their travels. Many of the individuals had arrived at Pandenarium in 1854, but they had departed before the turn of the decade. By 1860, only 31 residents remained. Those that left generally moved nearby to places such as Mercer Borough and Cool Spring Township, and they did this in search of economic opportunity. Prominent families within the community remained at Pandenarium. These prominent families included the Allen family, the Robinson family, the Johnson family, the Humphrey family, and the Lewis family. During their time along the Indian Run, many of the freedmen and their descendants participated in significant local and regional events and actively renegotiated their environment. Following their arrival to the community, many of the freedmen built houses something early historians kind of referred to as shacks along the Indian Run, as opposed to living in those provided to them further upstream. Unfortunately, the houses along the stream were eventually flooded, forcing the residents to move to higher ground in those pre-built houses. Several members of the community enlisted in the 22nd Regiment of the United States Colored Troops. Additionally, allegedly, the community was also a stop along the Underground Railroad, though the details of their involvement are scant. Throughout the final decades of the 19th century, the number of individuals living at Pandenarium continued to dwindle. By 1930, it is suggested that only 6 residents continued to reside in the community, and by 1940, the settlement had been completely abandoned. There were numerous local narratives as to why the community was so short-lived, many of which are steeped in racism and prejudice, and is something that Angie and I have tried to really tackle and address with some of our work at the site. Of the first generation freedmen at Pandenarium, John and Rosie Allen are arguably some of the most prominent. Rosie was the daughter of Joseph Duke, who had also been formerly enslaved by Everett. While Joseph settled in Mercer Borough, Rosie and her husband John settled down along the Indian Run. John Allen was the child of old Lucy Myers, who also was formerly enslaved by Everett. John and Rosie have deep connections with their fellow freedmen at Pandenarium, many of which were either siblings or cousins. Several historic maps place John and Rosie's residence in the center of Pandenarium. Several accounts of the community also suggest that the Allen home was a place of community gathering and religious worship. Rosie was often referred to as Aunt Rosie by members of the community. The Allen household served as a place of respite from the outside world. Written and spoken history about Pandenarium suggests that the surrounding community was not welcoming to the freedmen. There were reports of Ku Klux Klan night rides and accusations of theft and deceit unjustly leveled at the freedmen. These events likely fueled community unrest and mistrust of the world beyond the Indian Run. In 2011, Angela Gillette Wentling published her thesis, The People of Pandenarium, The Living Landscape of a Freed African American Settlement. In the study, she sought to determine the negotiated landscape of the settlement after the arrival of the freedmen. To accomplish this, she focused on 3 research areas at Pandenarium. Study Area 1 is the John Jr. and Lizzie Allen residence. John Jr. is the son of John and Rosie, and his wife Lizzie was a white woman. Study Area 2 is along the banks of the Indian Run, where the temporary housing or shacks were built upon the freedmen's arrival. And Study Area 3 is the John and Rosie Allen residence. Angie's thesis incorporated ground-penetrating radar, LIDAR, and excavation. The study determined that Pandenarium's negotiated landscape was dissimilar to that exhibited in a plantation setting. Rather than living in pre-built houses along a central road, which was a layout that is comparable to that of Mulberry Row at Monticello, the residents instead chose to settle around the Indian Run in Study Area 2. For my thesis research, I decided to conduct a comparative ceramic analysis using data from Pandenarium. John and Rosie's residence, the half cellar of which was encountered during Angie's thesis fieldwork, seemed to be the most representative household of the first generation of residents at Pandenarium, so they became the focus of my work. I wanted to conduct fieldwork to obtain a representative sample of artifacts from their residence and to compare it to other sites from the same period. The purpose of doing so was to uncover subsistence and socioeconomic patterns at the residence and determine whether those patterns were directly related to the occupant's status as freedmen. In order to do this, I picked archaeological sites with which to compare the Allen residence. The Old Economy Village in Beaver County, Pennsylvania, the Davis site at Timbuktu in Burlington County, New Jersey, and Mulberry Row Structure 2 at Monticello in Albemarle County, Virginia. Mulberry Row Structure 2, which I'll hereby refer to as MRS2, is one of the many structures along Mulberry Row, which were the enslaved quarters at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. The specific occupants of MRS2 are not known, but they were likely enslaved peoples. MRS2 is the latest dating domestic structure at Mulberry Row and was occupied from the 1780s to the 1820s. Within the study, MRS2 represented an archaeological assemblage of enslaved peoples that had labored on a large-scale plantation within the Piedmont region of Virginia. This was meant to compare the assemblage at the Allen residence to one that would closely resemble their lives prior to manumission. Timbuktu was a 19th century fugitive slave site, and like Pandenarium, it operated as a station for the Underground Railroad. The population of Timbuktu reportedly peaked during the Civil War and sharply declined by the second half of the 20th century. Many descendants of the people of Timbuktu live nearby and are directly involved with the archaeology at the site and the interpretation of the site. I specifically chose the Davis House, pictured here, as a focus of my analysis because it had been the subject of a large-scale excavation and was occupied during a similar period to that of the Allen residence. The occupant, William Davis, was also a Civil War veteran. The Davis assemblage was incorporated into the study to compare a freedman site to that of a fugitive site from the same period. Old Economy Village in Beaver County, Pennsylvania, was home to the Harmonist Society, a religious society of celibate German immigrants who immigrated to Western Pennsylvania under the leadership of George Rapp. The Harmonists were a communist society and were economically successful due to the various agricultural and manufacturing businesses they ran within the village. The last Harmonist died in 1852, and the site was excavated in 2007 by Heberling and Associates. The Old Economy Village served as a control site as it was in close proximity to Pandenarium. More excavation was required at the Allen residence in order to conduct a meaningful comparative ceramic analysis. As such, in 2017, we excavated 28 shovel tests in 2 test units within the immediate vicinity of the Allen residence. During the ceramic analysis, I incorporated Miller's Ceramic Cost Index and Shannon Weaver's Index for Diversity. Lastly, I ran a chi-square test in Kramer's V statistical on the following qualitative data sets: artifact description, wear type, vessel form, decoration color, and pattern type. Artifact description refers to the portion of the vessel that was recovered, with the categories being rim, body, base, handle, lid, or a combination of these. Wear type is a ceramic typology based on the vitrification, porosity, and glaze of a particular ceramic. And these characteristics have been used to create chronological typology for historic ceramics. Examples include ironstone, whiteware, and redware. Vessel form refers to the type of vessel from which the shirt originated. To simplify this process, I used 2 broader categories, utilitarian and tableware. And then when possible, sherds were also split into more specific categories such as cups, bowls, and plates. Decoration color and pattern type are pretty self-explanatory, so I won't go into those more here. As previously mentioned, I ran a quantitative analysis on each assemblage in the form of a Pearson's chi-squared statistic and a Kramer's V statistic. The purpose of these tests were to determine the independence of the variables, thus determining the statistical significance of each sample. I chose several qualitative attributes from the basis, or as the basis for this analysis. As previously mentioned, these are artifact description, wear type, vessel form, decoration color, and pattern type. I chose these characteristics based on the ability to answer research questions concerning socioeconomics and cultural diffusion. To visually display the results of the numerous chi-square statistics I ran would make this presentation much longer than I intended. So I'll opt to discuss the results of each test and display what I consider to be the more significant results. I was not incredibly pleased with the results of the chi-square concerning several of the qualitative attributes. This was due to miscategorization issues within the Timbuktu assemblage. The information included in the Timbuktu catalog was very broad and often misrepresentative. This made it difficult to tease out some of the detail necessary for the analysis. Despite this, each chi-square resulted in a statistical significance. Artifact description was sort of a bust due to the issues with the Timbuktu database, so I wasn't really able to determine anything conclusive or reliable with that data set. There were also some issues with Timbuktu in regard to wear type, but fortunately I was still able to glean some useful information. The Allen residence had the most stoneware, whereas the Old Economy Village had the most redware, and Mulberry Row Structure 2 had the most pearlware. Regarding vessel form, Timbuktu contained the highest number of tablewares, whereas Pandenarium had the highest number of utilitarian wares. Pandanarium and Mulberry Row Structure 2 had a significant number of plates, and Pandanarium had the most crocks. When it came to vessel form, Pandanarium had the highest association with Mulberry Row Structure 2. I was most interested in decoration color. Undecorated vessels were the most frequent category at all 4 sites. This is likely due to the accessibility of plain, refined earthenware during the 19th century. Upon removing the undecorated category, however, the presence of blue, polychrome, and brown decoration color is more apparent. The Kramers V determined that Pandanarium had a higher level of association with Mulberry Row Structure 2 than the other 2 sites. Pattern type was also interesting as it was the largest dependent variable. Like decoration color, undecorated ceramics were the most common at all 4 sites. Other variables were present in varying amounts at the sites. Pandanarium seemed to favor salt glazed stoneware, hand-painted wares, and transfer printing. Additionally, Pandanarium had the highest association with Mulberry Row Structure 2. The purpose of running the Miller Ceramic Cost Index was to assist in determining the economic status of the Allen family in a way that was easily comparable to other sites. This index is based on attributes such as wear type, vessel measurements and form, and decoration type. Each ceramic is assigned a value ranging from 0 to 7 based on these attributes, with 0 being the lowest and 7 being the highest. The resulting numbers are then added together and divided by the minimum number of vessels, or M and V. The result is a number that is representative of the assemblage as a whole. As you can see, the Allen residence was most similar to the Davis house at Timbuktu. This data seems to support what we already know about each site. Old Economy Village was relatively prosperous and manufactured many of their own ceramics and hence has a higher CC index. Mulberry Row Structure 2 was inhabited by enslaved people with limited control over their personal belongings and thus had the lowest CC index. And Pandanarium and Timbuktu are both antebellum sites in northern territories, yet despite one being a fugitive site and the other being associated with freedmen, it makes sense that their economic standing would be similar to each other and then also greater than that of an enslaved site. The Shannon-Weaver Diversity Index is typically applied to faunal and microfaunal assemblages to determine the diversity of the sample. Here, I've applied it to the ceramic assemblage instead. This was done using minimum number of vessels as opposed to minimum number of individuals, which is typically used in faunal analyses. This formula typically results in a negative value that is then changed into a positive value. The closer the resulting positive value is to 1, the less diverse the assemblage is. As you can see in the table, the Allen residence was most similar to Mulberry Row Structure 2. Both samples were significantly more diverse than that of Timbuktu and Old Economy Village. I suspect that this might be a result of the Allen status as previously enslaved and the fact that their former enslaver, Charles Everett, was one of similar economic means and close social standing to Thomas Jefferson. This could suggest that the Allens continued to purchase similar ceramics to those that were made available to them when they were enslaved. But it's also possible that the Allens chose to bring some ceramics with them on their journey to Pennsylvania. So what does all this data mean? It's easiest to understand when you look at the individual comparisons between Pandanarium and the other 3 sites. Overall, the chi-square and Kramers V results indicated that Pandanarium and Timbuktu were the least different regarding their ceramic assemblages. This is particularly true when it comes to decoration, color, pattern, and ceramic cost index values. This was also verified by the descriptive data. The results of this study implies that despite Timbuktu being a fugitive site and Pandanarium being a freedman site, this difference was not readily perceivable by white society. Both communities were probably treated similarly by the surrounding abolitionist-dominated communities. Historical documentation does not allude to any major differences in the economic opportunities afforded to fugitives, and freedmen alike. While it can be assumed that the Allen and Davis families lived vastly different lives, they likely shared similar experiences interacting with local communities, taking part in the Underground Railroad, securing jobs outside of subsistence agriculture, avoiding slave catchers, and ensuring their descendants were able to afford equal education opportunities. This comparison was quite revealing about two groups, antebellum fugitives and freedmen, who were of seemingly different legal and social standing, but were actually quite economically similar. Pandenarium and Old Economy Village shared the least similarities. While this may seem surprising as the two are geographically close, when considering that Old Economy Village existed in a different social, cultural, and economic setting than that of Pandenarium, it's not all that surprising. I think if I could go back in time, I would have picked a different control site. However, in 2017, when I began this research, relatively few sites in the region had been subject to large excavation, large enough in scale to produce a sizable ceramic assemblage. And I'd be interested to see if there are more compatible sites available now. Pandenarium and Mulberry Row structure too were similar in terms of wear type and diversity. The similarity in wear type can be attributed to the intentional or unintentional purchasing of ceramics similar to those made available to 19th century Virginia enslaved peoples. It's also possible that the Allens brought some of their belongings, such as ceramics, with them on their journey to Pandenarium. The high diversity at each site is explained by trends in material culture at enslaved sites. It was not uncommon for enslavers to pass down worn or outdated ceramics to the enslaved people, often resulting in mixed matched ceramic pieces in an assemblage, such as a single porcelain cup rather than a full set. This would suggest that the Allens continued to prefer much of the same material objects, at least in regard to ceramics, as they had during their time in Virginia. In summation, the Allens were of modest socioeconomic status. Their functional and modest ceramic assemblage had reflected their social situation as freedmen living in antebellum Pennsylvania. The Allen assemblage was affected by regional market trends, yet John and Rosie were still able to maintain a certain aspect of control over their material goods by maintaining a diverse collection of wares that either subconsciously or consciously reflected their lives back in central Virginia. From this, it is evident that a variety of factors influenced the lives of the people of Pandenarium. Yet despite these factors, the Allens were able to assert their autonomy through their material possessions. A common topic of discussion amongst Angie and I has been future research at Pandenarium. Since 2018, there have been several strides made in identifying and connecting the descendants of Pandenarium directly to the site. Since 2018, thanks to the hard work of Angie, a Pennsylvania historical marker was erected at the site in 2019. Earlier this year, thanks to the hard work of local historians and avocational archaeologists, a local bike tour highlighting the abolition story connected several descendants with Pandenarium, including those of John and Rosie. Going forward, I think a detailed ethnographic and oral history of the site needs to be compiled, and that this should be done with the consent and involvement of the descendants, as it is ultimately their story to tell. And as for future archaeological work, there's still much to be done, including an exhaustive pedestrian survey for the site, especially in the heavily wooded portions that Angie and I did not survey. Comprehensive shovel testing coupled with additional ground penetrating radar could also benefit in the identification of specific activity areas. Lastly, I really wanted to thank you all for taking the time to tune into this presentation, and the State Museum of Pennsylvania for including me in this workshop. It's so important that we get the message of Pandenarium out there, as until recently it was mostly ignored or misunderstood by the broader historical narrative of the antebellum Pennsylvania. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email me or Angie. Our email addresses are at the top of this last slide. And once again, thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Samantha. That was very interesting, and you have an excellent message at the end, so thank you. Janet, I think we have time for a few questions. Do we have any in the chat box, or?
We don't have any that are specific to Samantha's presentation. We have had several discussions about cemetery laws and preservation and community, and Section 106 and engagement of the community in how we work with communities, how we listen to them. Do you have any tips, maybe Samantha, as to how you were able to start to engage and empower the community there around Pandenarium?
Yeah, so if I'm being blatantly honest, Angie has done a lot of the legwork in regard to that. I'm located in North Carolina, so I'm not as close to the site physically. I know that she has done a lot of work with an individual who organized the that bike tour along I think Freedom Road, and was able to get in touch with a lot of the descendants in that way. So going forward, we really want to directly involve and have them kind of lead research. Of course, we don't know where that might take us, and obviously the direction we were going has completely changed now that we were able to get in direct contact with a variety of descendants from the site, which was previously when I was doing my work and when Angie was doing her work, we didn't have any descendants. And even though we were searching, we couldn't seem to find them at the time. So yeah, I think going forward, I think especially the ethnographic history, and I know we've discussed with Dr. Ford at IUP doing an ethnographic field school or something like that with descendants. I think going forward, that is our best bet in directly involving descendants at the site and in the local community, and basically allowing them to interpret the site or directly affect the interpretation and kind of guide where we go from there.
Did you do any research with the wills or deed documents, and was any of your background research that you conducted seeking some of those types of documents? And since you've been able to engage with some of those descendants, have any of them been able to provide additional documentation that you didn't have when interpreting?
Okay, so I've not been able to directly talk with any of them like in person or anything. Angie's done most of that, and from my understanding, I don't think any of them had directly provided us with documentation. It more so seemed to be oral history accounts that had been passed down about, you know, their ancestors that had lived at the site. So I personally couldn't find any sort of deeds or anything as detailed about the occupants of the site, especially not in regard to the first generation. I don't know if Angie can speak on that further, if she's found anything recently, but when it comes to John and Rose, I haven't found anything specifically.
I have a question here. Someone from the community that's looking to maybe assist with your project. And there have been a couple of people that have asked again for your email addresses. Could you repeat your email address for you and for Angie as well, please?
Yeah. So I think Sherry just put it in the chat. So mine is staylor@newsouthassociation.com. And Angie's is agilletwe@pennsylvania.gov. And so if you need to spell those out, those are located in the chat now.
I'll put them in the answers as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
How many interracial marriages have you found in Pandanarium, and could that have contributed to the external community not allowing that community to thrive?
So from my understanding, I think John Jr. and Lizzie are one of the few. And it's especially hard to say because by the time John Jr. and Lizzie were adults occupying the site, the population was dwindling more substantially compared to that of John and Rosie. So I don't believe it was that common of a phenomenon in that settlement particularly, though I'm unsure of Lizzie's direct association with the local white community. So I'm not quite sure that that was common, but I do think that greatly affected Angie's interpretation of what she saw near their residence.
Thank you. One other question is, there a compiled list of surnames for the area at Pandenarium and around Mercer County?
So I'm sure that exists specifically within the census record. I know that I did have a slide that had some of the census information with John and Rosie on it. And additionally, you can look at maps of the region and see a lot of the surnames present. I think the larger issue is that the community eventually dispersed with relatively few families remaining behind. I know the Humphreys and the Lewis family remained in the area, and maybe not specifically within the original settlement, but in the area longer than some of the other ones, along with the Allen family. So I'm sure looking at a resource like Ancestry would be really beneficial. I know Angie and I have looked at it a little bit, but it's difficult because a lot of those individuals that originally arrived at Pandenarium and their descendants moved out, really spread out to other places. So it's kind of hard to track where they went. But we do have the basis for that information available to us in census records on Ancestry. So.
Thank you.